Imagine, for a moment, an endless, indifferent ocean. A world stripped down to its two most basic elements, a merciless, blistering sun above and a bottomless, silent abyss below. There is no land, no hope, no sign that humanity ever existed at all. And adrift, in the center of this vast emptiness, is a small, decaying rubber raft. On this raft are two men, though they are barely recognizable as such. They are human skeletons, draped in sun-scorched, salt-encrusted skin. Their lips are black and cracked from a thirst so profound it has become a form of madness. Their bodies are covered in open sores that weep and sting in the constant spray of the sea. They are the last survivors of a B-24 bomber that fell from the sky, and this is their 47th day adrift in hell. The dark, menacing shapes of sharks are their constant companions, a silent, circling jury waiting for the inevitable. Every sunrise is a curse promising another day of torment. Every sunset brings the chilling cold of the Pacific night. Survival is measured in single drops of precious rainwater, in tiny, desperate bites of raw fish or bird, caught with bare, bleeding hands. One of these men, before he became this ghost of a human being, was an Olympian. He had been a marvel of human engineering, a young man whose legs were celebrated for their strength and speed. He had competed in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, running in front of Adolf Hitler himself, a symbol of American youth and vitality. A man born for the roar of the stadium crowds, for the glory of the finish line, was now locked in a primal life-or-death struggle with an albatross that had landed on his raft, fighting for a mouthful of its flesh. But here is the most chilling fact of this entire ordeal. This journey, 47 days of starvation, dehydration, and circling sharks, was not the worst part of his story. It was not the climax of his suffering. It was only the beginning. His rescue from the ocean would prove to be a descent into a far deeper, more calculated, and more personal hell. A hell constructed by the hands of men, from which almost no one returned with their mind or their soul intact. This is a story about the absolute limits of human endurance. It is a story about how much pain, humiliation, and cruelty a single human spirit can absorb before it shatters. And it is the story of a man who walked through fire, through water, and through the darkest chambers of human depravity, and refused to be broken. This is the story of Louis Zamperini. To understand the man who would survive the unsurvivable, you must first travel to the sun-drenched working-class town of Torrance, California, in the 1920s. This is where Louis Zamperini, the son of Italian immigrants, began his life. And from his earliest days, he was a force of nature, a whirlwind of restless energy and defiant mischief. He was not a bad kid at his core, but he was a wild one, a boy who seemed to be at war with the very concept of rules. As the child of immigrants who spoke little English at home, he was an outsider from the start. He was smaller than the other kids, and his Italian heritage made him a target for bullies. But Louis never backed down. He learned to fight, and he learned that the best defense was a good offense. This fighting spirit soon morphed into a career as a juvenile delinquent. He started with petty theft, stealing pies from windows, snatching bottles of milk from doorsteps. Soon he graduated to more organized heists, breaking into local stores and orchestrating schemes to steal from the local brewery. He was smart, he was fast, and he was utterly fearless. The local police knew him by name. His parents, Anthony and Louise, were at their wits' end. By the time he was a teenager, Louis was on a fast track to a life of crime, and most likely a prison cell. The one person who refused to give up on him was his older brother, Pete. Pete was everything Louis was not. He was popular, respected, an accomplished athlete, and a model student. Pete saw through Louis's tough exterior and recognized the same fierce, competitive energy that made him a good athlete. He knew that if that energy could be channeled, if it could be given a purpose, it could be a powerful force for good. Pete's solution was simple, and it would change the course of Louis's life forever. He dragged his rebellious younger brother, kicking and screaming, onto the high school track. At first, Louis hated it. Running was punishment. It was pain without purpose. He would deliberately lose races just to spite his brother. But Pete was persistent. He bribed him, he cajoled him, he trained with him, and he told him something that finally broke through Louis's defiant shell. "Louis," he said, "a moment of pain is worth a lifetime of glory." And then something clicked. Louis started to run, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He discovered that the same adrenaline that fueled his petty crimes could be used to push his body past its limits. He began to win, and then he began to dominate. He found that the roar of the crowd was more intoxicating than any stolen beer. The respect he earned on the track was more satisfying than the fear he had commanded in back alleys. He was no longer Louis the troublemaker, he was the Torrance Tornado. His speed was astonishing. He began shattering high school records across California. In 1934, he ran a mile in 4 minutes and 21 seconds, a new national high school record that would stand for nearly 2 decades. The boy who was once on a path to prison was now on a path to the Olympics. The 1936 Olympic Games were to be held in Berlin, Germany, the heart of Adolf Hitler's rising Third Reich. For a young man from Torrance, it was a world away. At the Olympic trials in New York, Louis faced a new level of competition and the brutal, suffocating heat of a New York summer. He was aiming for the 1,500 meters, but the race that would decide his fate was the 5,000 meters, a grueling 3-mile endurance test. He had never run it competitively before. In a display of sheer grit, he pushed through the pain and the heat and finished in a dead heat for first place. At the age of 19, the boy who couldn't be controlled was going to the Olympics. The journey to Berlin was an adventure in itself. The 10-day trip on the ocean liner was a feast for the young athletes, many of whom, like Louis, had grown up in the scarcity of the Depression. Louis, with his voracious appetite, gained over 10 pounds on the journey. He arrived in Berlin overweight and out of peak condition for his race. Berlin in 1936 was a city under a spell. The streets were immaculately clean, draped in massive swastika banners. The people were swept up in a tide of nationalistic fervor. It was a grand, intimidating stage designed to showcase the supposed superiority of Adolf Hitler's Aryan race. For the athletes, it was a surreal experience. Louis, ever the mischievous kid from Torrance, couldn't resist. In a now famous incident, he climbed a flagpole at the Reich Chancellery and stole a personal Nazi flag as a souvenir, barely escaping the guards. In the 5,000-meter final, Louis was out of his depth. He was competing against seasoned, stronger European runners. For most of the race, he was hopelessly behind. He knew he couldn't win. But as he entered the final lap, the voice of his brother Pete echoed in his head. A moment of pain is worth a lifetime of glory. He decided then and there to make that final lap the fastest lap of his life. He unleashed a final, explosive kick. He began to fly past other runners, his arms and legs pumping in a blur of motion. The crowd of 100,000 people rose to its feet, roaring at the sight of this unknown American's incredible finishing sprint. He didn't win the race. He finished 8th, but his final lap was clocked at an astonishing 56 seconds, a speed that was almost unheard of. His performance caught the attention of one very important spectator. Adolf Hitler himself requested a personal meeting with the young American runner. Standing before the German dictator, Louis was met with an eerie smile. Through an interpreter, Hitler said to him, "Ah, you're the boy with the fast finish." It was a surreal, chilling moment, a meeting of two men whose worlds would soon collide in the most violent way imaginable. Louis Zamperini left Berlin with a stolen Nazi flag, a handshake from a dictator, and his sights set on the 1940 Tokyo Olympics, where he was favored to win the gold medal. But history, of course, had other plans. The 1940 and 1944 Olympic Games were canceled, swallowed by the war that was consuming the globe. The man who was built to run for glory now found himself in the United States Army Air Forces, training to be a bombardier. He was assigned to a B-24 Liberator, a massive, notoriously difficult-to-fly bomber nicknamed the Flying Coffin. He and his crew were stationed in Hawaii, part of the relentless air campaign against Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. On May 27, 1943, Louis and his pilot, Russell Allen Phil Phillips, were assigned a routine search and rescue mission. Their usual plane was undergoing repairs, so they were given a replacement B-24, a temperamental aircraft the crews had nicknamed the Green Hornet. It was known to be a lemon, a plane with a history of mechanical problems. But orders were orders. They took off from the island of Funafuti, heading out over the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific. A few hours into the flight, disaster struck. An engine on the left wing sputtered and died. Phil fought to keep the heavy plane stable, but then the second engine on the same wing failed. With no power on one side, the B-24 became uncontrollable. It entered a terrifying, irreversible dive. Inside the plane, there was a moment of pure adrenaline-fueled chaos. The men scrambled to brace for impact. Louis, tangled in wires near his gun turret, had no time to prepare. He saw a flash of his entire life, a rapid-fire slideshow of his childhood, his family, his races, and then the plane hit the water. The impact was cataclysmic. a deafening roar of twisting metal and rushing water. The world went black. When Louis regained consciousness, he was sinking deep into the ocean, trapped in a spaghetti of wires and wreckage. The pressure was immense. He was bleeding, disoriented, and his lungs were screaming for air. In a final desperate surge of his athletic strength, he managed to untangle himself and shoot towards the surface, bursting into the sunlight, gasping for air. The Green Hornet was gone, vanished beneath the waves. The only signs of its existence were a spreading oil slick and a few pieces of floating debris. And then he saw them. 2 inflatable rubber rafts had automatically deployed and were bobbing on the surface. He swam to one, and soon he was joined by 2 other survivors: his pilot, Phil, and the tail gunner, Francis McNamara. Of the 11 men who had been on the plane, only these 3 remained. They were alive, but they were hundreds of miles from the nearest land, with no water, no food, and no idea if anyone was even looking for them. Their ordeal had just begun. The Pacific Ocean is a beautiful but profoundly cruel wilderness. For the 3 survivors on the 2 small rafts, it became a personal purgatory. The first few days were a blur of shock and hope. They were certain a search party would find them. But as the days stretched into a week, hope began to curdle into despair. The sun was their primary torturer. It beat down relentlessly, blistering their skin and boiling their brains. The salt water was a constant irritant, turning every small cut into a festering sore. Thirst was a maddening, all-consuming obsession. Their world shrank to the desperate, agonizing wait for the next rain shower, where they would try to catch a few precious mouthfuls of fresh water. Their meager emergency rations, a few squares of chocolate and some water, were gone within the first day. In a moment of panic, Mac had eaten all the chocolate. It was a fatal mistake that Louis and Phil, with their stronger discipline, had avoided. From then on, survival depended on their own ingenuity. Louis, drawing on the resourcefulness of his delinquent youth, became their primary provider. He fashioned fish hooks from pins and used bird flesh as bait. They learned to catch small sharks with their bare hands, grabbing them by the tail and clubbing them to death, drinking their blood for hydration and eating their livers for nutrients. When an albatross landed on the raft, Louis stalked it with the patience of a predator, capturing it and wringing its neck. Nothing was wasted. The psychological torment was as bad as the physical. The monotony was maddening, an endless cycle of scorching days and freezing nights. They battled delirium, their minds playing tricks on them. Sharks were a constant, terrifying presence. Their fins would slice through the water, and their bodies would bump against the bottom of the raft at night, a chilling reminder of the abyss that lay just inches beneath them. On the 27th day, they saw a plane. Hope surged through them. They fired their flares and waved frantically. The plane, a Japanese bomber, circled them once. They thought they were saved. And then the plane came around again, and its machine guns opened up. A storm of bullets ripped through the water around them and tore through their raft. They dove into the shark-infested water, using the raft for cover. Miraculously, none of them were hit, but their main raft was now a deflating wreck. They all crowded onto the smaller, less stable raft, their tiny island of survival, now even more precarious. After more than a month at sea, Mac, weakened by starvation and despair, finally succumbed. His body, which had once been that of a strong young soldier, was little more than a skeleton. Louis and Phil held a small, solemn service and gently slipped his body into the ocean. On the 47th day, after drifting over 2,000 miles, Louis and Phil, two emaciated, delirious specters, finally saw it land. It was an island. As they drifted closer, a boat came out to meet them. They were saved. As the Japanese sailors pulled them from the raft, Louis could only summon the strength to whisper. They had survived the unsurvivable. But their rescue was in fact a capture. They had washed ashore on an island controlled by the Japanese Navy. Their journey into the abyss was just beginning. Louis and Phil were now prisoners of war. They were shipped to a secret interrogation center called Ofuna, a place not officially registered as a POW camp, meaning it was not subject to any international laws or inspections. It was a place where prisoners were starved, beaten, and systematically broken. Here, Louis was separated from Phil. He was alone again. The purpose of Ofuna was to break the spirit. The prisoners were given just enough food to keep them barely alive, leading to rampant malnutrition and disease. The guards were brutal, administering random, savage beatings for the smallest infractions or for no reason at all. But for all its horrors, Ofuna was just a prelude. Louis was eventually transferred to Omori, a POW camp near Tokyo, and it was there that he met the man who would become his personal devil, the focal point of all the cruelty and evil of the war. His name was Mutsuhiro Watanabe. The prisoners had a nickname for him. They called him the Bird. Watanabe was a corporal, a low rank, but he ruled the camp with absolute sadistic terror. He was a man from a privileged background who had been denied a commission as an officer, a humiliation that had twisted him into a monster. He was a connoisseur of cruelty, a man who found a perverse psychological artistry in the breaking of other men. And for some reason, from the moment he saw Louis Zamperini, the famous Olympian, he became obsessed. The Bird singled Louis out for a special, relentless campaign of torture. He would beat him unconscious with his belt buckle or a kendo stick for making eye contact. He forced Louis to hold excruciating stress positions for hours. He knew Louis had been a runner, so he would force him to run races against Japanese guards, only to beat him savagely when he won. It was a sick, twisted psychological game. The Bird was determined to shatter the spirit of the famous American athlete, to prove that even a hero could be broken. The abuse was constant, a daily grind of pain and humiliation. In one of the most notorious incidents, the Bird, furious that Louis had become a symbol of defiance among the prisoners, ordered every single man in the camp, over 200 of them, to line up and punch Louis in the face, one by one. The prisoners themselves, starving and terrified, had no choice. For over 2 hours, Louis stood there, taking punch after punch from his own comrades, until he was a bloody, unrecognizable mess. But he did not fall. When the Bird was transferred to a new camp, the infamous Naoetsu, he made sure Louis was transferred with him. The nightmare would continue. And it was at Naoetsu, in the freezing cold of a Japanese winter, that Louis faced his ultimate test. The Bird, enraged by a minor infraction, grabbed a massive, heavy wooden beam, nearly 6 feet long. He ordered Louis to lift it over his head. "If you drop it," he hissed, "I will have a guard shoot you." Louis, weak from dysentery and starvation, somehow found the strength to lift the beam. He stood there, his muscles screaming, his vision blurring. A minute passed, then 5, then 10. The other prisoners watched in horrified silence. The bird watched with a sadistic grin, waiting for him to collapse. But Louis did not collapse. He locked eyes with his tormentor, and in that gaze was a fire of pure, unbroken defiance. He held that beam for 37 minutes. Finally, a shocked and infuriated Watanabe, defeated in his own twisted game, charged forward and knocked Louis and the beam to the ground. Louis Zamperini had been beaten, starved, and tortured, but he had not been broken. In August of 1945, the war ended. When the American forces arrived at the Naoetsu camp, they found men who were barely alive. Louis Zamperini, who had once been a powerful 160-pound athlete, weighed less than 80 pounds. He was finally free. He returned home to a hero's welcome. He was showered with honors and married the love of his life, Cynthia. But the war was not over for him. It had followed him home. He was haunted by crippling nightmares, waking up screaming, his hands around his wife's throat, dreaming he was strangling the bird. He was suffering from a profound, undiagnosed case of post-traumatic stress disorder. To numb the pain and silence the ghosts, he turned to alcohol. The hero who had survived a plane crash, 47 days at sea, and years of torture was now being destroyed by his own inner demons. His marriage was falling apart. His life was spiraling out of control. It was his wife, Cynthia, on the verge of filing for divorce, who convinced him to attend a crusade led by a charismatic young preacher named Billy Graham. Louis went reluctantly, cynically. He stormed out of the first sermon, but he agreed to go back a second time. That night, as Graham spoke of struggle, redemption, and forgiveness, something inside Louis shifted. He was suddenly transported back to the raft, remembering the promise he had made to God during a storm. "If you will spare me," he had prayed, "I will serve you forever." He had survived, but he had forgotten his promise. That night, he walked forward and renewed his vow. The experience was transformative. For the first time since the war, he slept without a nightmare. The all-consuming hatred he felt for the bird, a poison that had been eating him alive, began to dissipate, replaced by a strange and powerful new feeling, a desire to forgive. Louis Zamperini dedicated the rest of his long life to this newfound purpose. He started a camp for troubled youth, helping kids who were on the same destructive path he had once been on. He became a public speaker, sharing his incredible story of survival and forgiveness. In 1950, he returned to Japan, not for revenge, but for reconciliation. He visited Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, where many of his former guards were now imprisoned as war criminals. He met with them, he embraced them, and he offered them his forgiveness. The only man he could not meet with was Mutsuhiro the bird Watanabe, who had escaped justice and was hiding in anonymity. Years later, in 1998, at the age of 81, Louis returned to Japan one last time to carry the Olympic torch for a leg of its journey to the Winter Games in Nagano. He remained unbroken,